May I ask you to come and to join us, people who are more or less hesitating. Well, my name is Asad Ilyas Katan. I'm the holder of the chair in Orthodox theology at the Center for Religious Studies at the University of Münster in Germany, and I'm going to head this session. Before embarking on our session and on our project, I would like also in my name, given the fact that I belong to the organizers of this conference, to express my thanks to Bishop Ignatius, not only for his hospitality and for the friendship, but also for supporting the Academy of Volos as a free and unbiased forum. Thank you very much, Your Eminence. Well, this evening, the Greeks would say mesimeri. This evening, I have the honor to introduce two speakers who need not be introduced. And this is one of the antinomies of my role as moderator. The term antinomy was cherished by Saint Gregory Palamas. Well, to my right, His Eminence John Zizioulas, Metropolitan of Pergamon, one of the most outstanding thinkers and Orthodox theologians of our time, known for his books and articles, especially for having developed an ontology based on the concept of person and hypostasis in order to engage in a constructive dialogue with modern and postmodern philosophy. Your Eminence, thank you for coming, for joining us in our conference. To my left, Father Gregorios Papathomas, an old friend, professor of canon law at the University of Athens and at the Theological Institute Saint-Serge in France. He is also a member of the board of directors of the Volos Academy and president of the European Forum of Orthodox Schools of Theology. We shall start with Father Papathomas, who is going to tackle the issue of ethnophilitism and the so-called diaspora, national or territorial principle. Please.
Good evening to everyone. The title of my presentation, as you can all see in front of you, is Ethnophilitism and the so-called diaspora. As you may see on the program, I've put the diaspora in quotation marks, and I call it so-called, and you will see why. I have 5 topics in my paper, and this is one of the reasons why I asked the organizers to distribute the text in Greek, because it contains some figures and some diagrams. The preparatory work for the Holy and Great Pan-Orthodox Synod have finalized a list of topics for discussion. Out of the 105 topics that were proposed in 1961 by the Pan-Orthodox Conference in Rhodes, the first preconciliar Pan-Orthodox Conference in 1976 selected only 10. These 10 subjects were considered to be the most important and urgent pressing issues to be discussed. The first and most important question was the question of the diaspora. and it is a subject that has been studied a lot in the past, and it is a multifaceted issue with many aspects. I will try to focus on only one aspect, which, in my opinion, is central and is the cause, what is creating this problem. And this issue is the fact that has been already been determined by the Council, the issue of philletism. Therefore, the issue is not so recent. It goes back in time and goes before the creation of the problem of diaspora on the socio-political front. So I think it is important for methodological reasons to study the issue of ethnophilletism in the beginning, because ethnophilletism is what caused the creation of the issue of national autocephaly and national autocephalous churches. The word ethnophilletism is a neologism. It was a word that was coined by the Pan-Orthodox Synod in Constantinople in 1872. And it is a composite word from the two Greek words ethnos and phili, nation and, let's say, race. And it was used at the time to condemn an irregularity that was happening at the time in the Orthodox Church. I believe it is important for us in this conference to see why the Council decided to coin a term and what they were trying to describe. First of all, the word phili, which means race, and produces the words racism or tribalism, is the application of giving of the concept of that the race and the nation are more important than the kingdom of Christ. It is actually making discriminating on the basis of race or nation inside the church. We are given priority to the members of the same race, of the same nation, at the same time excluding and discriminating against those who are members of different races or nations, even though they are members of the same church. So, in any attempt to create a church within history, ethnophilletism is a confusion between church and nation, the identification sometimes between the church and the nation. Ethnophilletism makes the church follow the aims and the objectives of the race or of the nation, or even worse, is trying to appropriate and bring together members of a different racial or a different group or a different nation. We can refer to ethnophiletic church, that is, a church of our own, which is a concept totally unacceptable and irregular from an ecclesiological point of view. It is completely irregular and unjustified based on the holy canons. However, in practice, this is precisely what's happening. Ecclesiologically referring to the Church of the Greeks, or the Church of the Russian Church, or the Romanian Church, or the Serbian Patriarchate, that these are unacceptable terms, but are practiced all the time. Ethnophilletism is an ecclesiological heresy that appeared in 1870 when the Bulgarian Exarchate was created in Constantinople, what was tried in Constantinople to organize on itself on the basis of nation, of race, or better yet, cultural basis, which led to the co-territorial coexistence of many different churches and many different church jurisdictions. Each of these jurisdictions would be responsible for preaching to the members of their respective nations or races. Let me say that in trying to define ethnophilitism, we are at the same time giving a definition that could be applied to the diaspora, which shows, in my opinion, why there is a direct cause and effect relationship. So the appearance of ethnophilitism is a strange type of nationalism that gives more importance to national unity rather than unity in Christ. This is why the Holy and Great Council in Constantinople in 1872 condemned ethnophilitism as modern ecclesiological heresy. In the West, it is being referred to as a Balkan heresy. It is theologically obvious that ethnophilitism is unacceptable both on theological and ecclesiological grounds. And this is true both when ethnophilitism appears in the case of a church in a specific territory and in the case of the diaspora. Ethnophilitism is based on the creation of autocephalous church inside the state or a national church in the diaspora based not on geographical, Eucharistic and ecclesiological criteria, but rather on national criteria such as the common nationality or common language. However, as Metropolitan Maximus of Sardia would say, creating a church whose member would be only those who are members of the same nation, that is what ethnophilitism is doing, is historically unprecedented. Therefore, the Church, following its eschatological mission, should not in any case be linked and be identified with what will happen with the fate of a single nation or a single race. This is why the Orthodox ecclesiological tradition does not accept any form of ethnophilitism or ethnophiletic messianism. On the other hand, or from a historical perspective, we need to make the distinction between ethnism, which is a positive concept, a concept of being a patriot, and nationalism, which is a negative concept and refers to the idea that our own nation is superior to the others, and which inevitably will lead to racism. I believe that ethnism supports the interests of any nation, whereas nationalism is against these interests. This is why ethnism is compatible with the creation of churches based on geographical criteria, whereas nationalism is a denial of the eschatological mission of the Church. Therefore, the Church should never be created and founded based on national grounds. Therefore, the autocephaly is never given to a specific nation. It is given to a people who has specific geographic limits, delimitation, and that people should participate in the same church regardless of their personal respective national origins and identities. Therefore, the ideal would be to have churches in nation states or churches in independent states rather than national states. And this is, I believe, in the heart of the problem of what we've been discussing these days. Now let us see autocephaly from an ecclesiological and canonical point of view. We have two questions to answer. First of all, an autocephalous church, does it have jurisdiction outside its geographical limits to other geographical areas and to other persons? And secondly, if we say that the canons forbid a jurisdiction going beyond the geographical limits, we have to answer the question of whether there is, objectively speaking, what we call a diaspora. The response I would give, based on the ecclesiological tradition and the canons, is no. However, what is happening right now, at present, in practice, is yes. Is that the response is yes. So, as what we are preaching as theologists does not translate to practice. I would even say that the first choice is the ecclesiological one, whereas the second choice is the ethnophiletic one. Based on the tradition of our church for over 2,000 years, the geographic and personal jurisdiction of an autocephalous church is limited within its geographical limits. That church does not have any jurisdiction beyond these limits. If that was to apply to all Orthodox churches, then we would not have the problem of diaspora. So why are we still having the problem of diaspora? I believe this is happening because some Orthodox churches did not understand what the Council of Chalcedon had decided regarding the autocephalous, did not understand the importance of Catholicity, of ecumenicity, sorry. The Fourth Ecumenical Council, and 451, made it clear that these autocephalous churches would be in communion. So they are different from a geographical point of view, but they are in communion between them. That council, therefore, on theological and ontological grounds, was asking for ecclesiological difference and community at the same time. If we are not to follow this logic, these rules, we are in fact creating a huge problem, and we are in fact making the church disappear. It is an attack against the diversity, and at the same time this changes the true nature of the church. So, there are two forms of irregularity here. First of all, the ethnophilitic irregularity, which is expressed in the activity of the churches in the communities of the diaspora, which creates co-territoriality and deformation of the identity of the church, which is precisely what that council wanted to avoid, and what the previous council, the Second Ecumenical Council, wanted to avoid when it said that there should be no confusion of churches at any time. On the other hand, when we are not following the rule that the church should be undivided, is creating a situation in which one church in one region is trying to absorb a church in another region, which is also irregular and not permitted by the ecumenical councils. So, when autocephaly is recognized, first of all, the primordial characteristic is the geographical characteristic and not the national identity. This should also be reflected afterwards in the way the autocephalous church will be functioning. And geographical rules still apply when this autocephalous church expresses and enforces its jurisdiction. I believe that in the future Pan-Orthodox Council, we will need to define and clarify the issue of autocephaly, and this will very easily lead us to resolve the problem of diaspora. I believe that we should discuss the question of autocephaly first and the diaspora next. Therefore, we should first talk about the cause and then about the effect. Because what I'm saying is that the problem of the diaspora is the effect of the cause, which is autocephaly. And I've given you a little diagram which shows the proposed order in which the Council would talk about these subjects. Right now we have in number 1 diaspora, number 2 autocephaly, number 3 autonomy, number 4 the diptychs. This is the 1976 proposal. However, what I am proposing is to change the order, to talk about the autocephaly first, then autonomy, then diptychs, and finally the diaspora. And this will surprise us, because if we follow this order, diaspora will no longer be a problem. The concept of diaspora is incompatible with the way that the church is organized. If we resolve the issue of autocephaly and autonomy first, these two issues, we will not even have to discuss the issue of diaspora, which perhaps might indicate that the reason why we still have the problem is because of some autocephalous churches trying to have a jurisdiction beyond their geographical limits, although this was condemned by numerous councils. How could it be possible for the church to regularize, to accept ecclesiological ethnophilitism as being racist, nationalist, and ecclesiological culturalism? However, this is the ideology that has been fueling the existence of what we call the so-called diaspora. There is a contradiction in all that. Theologically, we had the strength to condemn ethnophilitism as a heresy. Compare that, for example, to Roman Catholics or Protestants who failed to understand that ecclesiastic culturalism or ritualism and confessionalism in the 16th century or 13th century would create a problem. And these two, Roman Catholics and Protestants, did not condemn these ideologies. The Orthodox did condemn ethnophilitism. in words. However, ever since the 19th century, in practice, we are doing the exact opposite. In practice, we are doing precisely what the Council condemned. Because we know that modern ethnophilitism has changed the Church from being based on geographical criteria on something that is fueling national separatism. So the Church would say that since it was condemned, since there is a decision by the Council, that would be enough. But I believe that we need to practice what we're preaching. It is, in my opinion, enough for anyone if they were to stay for a little time in these areas where there are Orthodox diaspora to see how many problems this situation creates. I think you will be surprised if you were to see the ways in which these churches are organized and functioning. Because, in fact, we Orthodox, after the 1870, we have started to refer to the world based on ethnophiletic and culturalistic categories. I have created a diagram that shows the correspondence and a comparison between the two concepts. In the first case, we have État-nation. That's the left column, and on the right hand we have nation-état, let's say. On the first case, we are based on jus soli, whereas a nation-état would be based on jus sanguinis. On the first case, we have national ethnicism and statism, whereas in the second case we would have ethnophilitism and an identification between the nation and the state. The left column is what applies to the West, whereas the right column is what applies to the East. In the West, we have the state trying to have control over the church, whereas in the East, we have an identification between the nation and the church. And let me move directly to my conclusions. When the state becomes the center of a nation, this is very correct. This is legally totally acceptable. And indeed is perfectly acceptable for the state to exercise its sovereignty and its law to all its citizens throughout the world. But what happens if the same thing or an analogous thing happens to the church? What happens if a church tries to apply its jurisdiction to people outside its geographical limits? This goes against the holy canons. So I don't think the problem ends with the problem of diaspora. I think there is an even bigger problem. If the church was to identify itself with a nation, the church will try to be used for national awakening on a global level then. And this would lead to an ecclesiological globalism. So we need urgently to resolve the problem of diaspora. You've listened to some of the statutes of some of the churches earlier during the presentation of Mr. Meyendorf, and you've seen how the Church of Cyprus and Russia are trying to exercise universal jurisdiction. That could possibly lead to 5, 10, 15 global universal churches competing for universal jurisdiction throughout the globe. We have two options, either to follow ethnophilitisms or to follow the holy canons. Ethnophilitism has created an ethnophiletic church, which has created the diaspora. And what's the other option? We have a state which will define the limits, the geographical limits of every church. Therefore, there are no diasporas. And on a global level, what do we have? A church in unity. Many locally defined churches that will be in unity. I believe this is the solution to our problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Gregorius, for this reflection. From the vantage point of canon law, we move on immediately to the second issue, primacy and nationalism. Your Eminence, you have the word.
Thank you. Σας ευχαριστώ, κύριε Πρόεδρε. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to His Eminence of the Metropolitan of Demetrius and to the Academy because they have included this problematic of this conference in their work, which is very multifaceted. It is not an exaggeration to say that this is a historically significant conference, not only because for the first time we are preoccupied with such a critical issue, but also because we deal with it at a historical moment which is really critical. And if we did not really pay attention and take care of this topic as Orthodox at this precise historical moment, then we will have to deal with very grave problems in the future. So the topic of my own presentation is very relevant to what we have already heard from Reverend Gregorios Papathomas. I listened very attentively to what he had to say. And his presentation made me think for the first time, created some thoughts in me for the first time, so it was quite original. And this is a topic that preoccupies me personally. My own presentation will be different in the sense that I tend to connect all these problems looking at the deeper ecclesiological background, which is the manifestation and realization of the Church, the mystery of the Eucharist. So after this introduction, I will move on with my presentation, and I think we will have the opportunity to talk more about it. I think that what I will say will be complementary to what Reverend Gregorios said. But if there is some repetition, I don't think that would be a problem. It just proves that there is a common ground for our reflection in the context of contemporary Orthodox theology. The topic of my own presentation is primacy in the context of the broader problematic of the conference, which is ecclesiology and nationalism. The basic question is, how can primacy in the Orthodox Church function given the existence of nationalism? How does it affect how does the problematic of ecclesiology and nationalism affect the concept of the primacy in the Orthodox Church? But in order to answer this question, we must first outline very briefly the basic theological and ecclesiological principles that support the development of the concept of primacy in the Orthodox Church. The historians who are not theologians are usually satisfied by explaining primacy based on historical and social factors such as political conjuncture, the impact of historical circumstances, ideological trends, power struggles, etc. Of course, undoubtedly such factors have played and do still play a role in the practice of primacy in the life of the Church. Already in the ancient Church, the primacy was connected to the political significance of the seat of a church, such as Rome, Constantinople, etc. And the Church primacy became a primacy of power. And this, of course, had an impact on the relations between the various churches or in the relations between the Church and the secular power. However, the theological factor was never missing in the concept of primacy. Rome, very early on, attributed the primacy of the Pope to the will of the Christ and the idea of succession from Peter, whereas the churches of the East connected it very early with the apostolicity of a church, thanks to which the church could pronounce with authority on issues of faith. Both the concept of the pentarchy and the rank of the patriarchates in Byzantium were formed in relation to theological discourse. Thus, the canonicity, that is, the invocation of the authenticity of the sacred canons, became an ecclesiological issue and not just an issue of practical needs or arrangements that could be modified. The concept of primacy and the relevant rank were ecclesiologically established and not just historically determined. So when a particular church lost its political significance, it retained its rank that was determined by the holy canons. So the position of a church did not depend on its political significance, although in the beginning, of course, in the early days when they acquired this rank, they took into account its political significance, of course, but this was not the main criterion. So how can primacy be justified based on the nature of the Church, as this is revealed in history and especially in the Eucharist? Can the concept of primacy be accommodated in a Eucharistic approach of ecclesiology? The late Father Nicholas Athanasius, who became the proponent of Eucharistic theology in our time, could not compromise such as juridical concepts, such as the concept of primacy, with the Eucharist. For him, every idea of power and hierarchy was incompatible by definition with the Eucharist. But even those who do not accept, who do not adopt the Eucharistic ecclesiology, have difficulty in connecting the concept of primacy with the nature of the Church. They tend to avoid speaking of a primacy iure divino. But if we examine carefully the nature and the structure of the Eucharist, we will find out that the primacy constitutes one of its essential features. Of course, as the Eucharist has historically evolved through the possibility of its performance by a single priest, the connection of the primacy and the Eucharist was not manifest. But for a long period of time, the Eucharist was a gathering of the whole people in a certain land with a clear hierarchical structure, presided by the bishop and surrounded by the elders. And due to his position in the Eucharist, the bishop acquired the right to represent the Church in the holy councils. A local church without a primacy would be inconceivable for that theological region. The primacy of the bishop was an element of Eucharism, an essential element of the Eucharist itself. And that's how it reached the canonicity of the Church. The idea that there can be no Church without primacy also reached the level of the regional structure of the Church when it was shaped by the institution of the metropolises and later of the patriarchates. Probably in connection with the institution of the Holy Synods, the primacy of the metropolitan was developed according to the 34th canon of the Holy Apostles, text of the 4th century. The metropolitan should be considered the head, and they could not do without him. So the primacy became an essential element of the institution of the council, and the council became the framework of its exercise. There can be no primacy without a council in the Orthodox Ecclesiology, but there can also be no council without primacy. Also, the primacy was expanded in the institution of the patriarchates and the autocephalous churches, connected with the synods, and it was also expanded to the ecumenical, universal level in the form of the ecumenical councils. The primacy in the Church is based fundamentally on the overcoming of all divisions in the body of the Church. This is the great and existential significance of primacy, or of kephalí, the head, as it was called in the language of the canons. This terminology is borrowed by Christology. Just as Christ is the head of the body of the Church, and all divisions are overcome in this body. There are no men or women, there are no Greek or Jews, there are no slaves or freemen, etc. So in the person of the bishop, all the natural, social, or other divisions are overcome, and they are fused together. The fact that the concept of the bishop as the head has this particular significance of the overcoming of the natural and social division is manifest by the provision of the holy canons that in every city, in every local church, there cannot be but only one bishop. This is the 8th canon of the First Ecumenical Council. It is interesting to note that in the ancient church, the concept of a nation, ethnos, did not exist in the contemporary sense of the term, but there were some cultural and linguistic particularities within the city. For instance, in Antioch, there were Greek-speaking and Syrian-speaking groups, but the church did not introduce two bishops in the same city based on the argument that the pastoral needs would demand that. There are some historical indications that there could be different parishes for serving these needs, but not episcopates, not bishoprics. The bishop as the head and as the primate, based on the model of Christ, had to unite everyone in a single body independently of gender, of race, of social status, of every member of the community. This principle was also transferred at the level of broader geographical areas such as metropolises, patriarchates, etc., and was the basis for the development in the Orthodox ecclesiology of the canonical principle of territoriality that Father Gregorius mentioned. The Church is comprised by geographical unities and not by cultural unities, and the bishops bear a geographical title in their name. There are no bishops without a geographical title. And this goes back already in the first centuries in the New Testament, where the Church is geographically determined. And in all the minutes of the ancient synods, the ancient councils, the bishops sign with their geographical title. This principle of territoriality is not just a canonical issue, but it is connected with the overcoming of all differences that may coexist in a single area and in the person of a bishop. If there is no such office of the primate in a local church, then we have a serious ecclesiological problem which is connected to the very nature of the church as the body of Christ. All this is true also in the broader geographical levels and constitute the basis for the metropolitan, patriarchal, and autocephalous churches, each of which has clearly determined geographical boundaries that they cannot exceed. So it is not an issue of administrative or political nature when in 1872 the Council of Constantinople condemned ethnophilitism as a heresy and not just as a deviation from the canons. The principle of territoriality is relevant to the very nature of the Church because it derives from the Christology itself, according to which in the body of Christ there are no Greeks or Jews, etc., etc. Or we could say there is no Bulgarian and Greek at a later case. All these issues are very serious and they justify the characterization of heresy if we situate them on the basis of ecclesiology that we analyzed before, according to which the Christological and Eucharistic nature of the Church imposes the principle of territoriality in combination with the existence of a primate in every locality. This principle expresses the eschatological nature of the Church, since only at the last days the kingdom of God will be realized and all divisions created by history will be overcome. The Church, by its nature, is the image of the eschaton, the last days, and every alteration, every alienation of this image constitutes a heresy. The Church, as the image of the last days, is not allowed by its very nature to absolutize historical formation and to divide its members based on these formations. Nationalism does not seem to have preoccupied the ancient church in the way that it did in modern times. From a theological perspective, it is included in what we said before about the eschatological overcoming of the natural and social divisions in the body of the Eucharist and of the Church. If in the Church there is no man or woman, and distinction contained in nature according to the will of the Creator, then this is even more so the case with the national particularities, which are human constructs, despite the fact that, according to some view, the nation is a product of the will of God. in any case, when we speak about overcoming of the divisions of any nature, such as social, natural, cultural divisions, we don't mean the abolition of differences, but the abolition of their divisive nature. So this neither nor has to be interpreted in the spirit of Saint Maxim, in the sense of a distinction between difference and division. Difference is good and comes from God, he says, but division is not. When we are speaking about the overcoming of divisions, we do not mean their eradication, but the acceptance of differences. At this point, we see the importance, the ecclesiological importance of primacy as we described it above. Within the body of the Church, many ethnicities, many nations can coexist. And also many ages, many genders, races, social classes, etc. can also coexist. But if each of these different nationalities claims to have its own primacy, then difference is transformed, is converted into division. So the primacy is not a form of power, despite that it can be used abusively in this way, but it is a necessary and unique tool for avoiding division. The fact that it can be used abusively as a tool for oppression does not justify its abolition, since we cannot gather the local church in any other way within a single body. Protestantism abolished primacy, and ever since it is struggling to save the unity of the church with the help of moral principles or other means, etc. Orthodoxy preferred to preserve the concept of the primacy, both at the symbolic liturgical level and at the canonical level, using the synodic system, the council system, as a safeguard. When we see the primacy as the necessary tools for overcoming division within the body of the Church, then we understand the reason why nationalism can lead to an ecclesiological deviation or a heresy, not through the simple acceptance and coexistence of different nations, but with the understanding of the primacy on the basis of nationality. The Orthodox Church in the diaspora is experiencing today such a deviation, and we have already heard interesting things about Father Gregory about that. The Orthodox Church through the century has observed the principle of territoriality by determining precisely the geographical boundaries of each autocephalous church with its founding volume. The term volume, tomos, precisely denotes territoriality. So within the territory of such a church, there are no primate bishops based on nationality. All nationalities that exist in this land are automatically subordinate to the primate of that area. That's how we understand neither Greek nor Jew in the Church. But in our time, especially since the 20th century, for the first time, initially from the side of the Russian Church, the geographical limits of the Patriarchate of Constantinople were disputed based on Holy Canon 28 of the Fourth Ecumenical Council, which was interpreted in such a way by Russian scholars already since the 19th century, so that the diaspora would be considered from a canonical point of view as a no man's land. And thus, for the first time, the principle of territoriality was abolished in practice, and the phenomenon of the existence of many primates, bishops in the same geographical area was introduced. This issue is connected directly with nationalism. which emerged in Orthodoxy in modern times. And this is proven by the fact that the installation of many bishops in the diaspora was not conducted on the basis of autocephaly, as it is badly interpreted sometimes. The Greek-speaking Orthodox autocephalous church, for example, did not, never installed their own bishops in the diaspora, thus recognizing that that area belongs to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The other Orthodox churches, by invoking national and cultural criteria, installed their own bishops. So the problem of the diaspora has to be considered historically as a consequence of the penetration of nationalism in Orthodoxy. And it would not be an exaggeration to characterize it as an ecclesiological deviation and a heresy in Orthodoxy. The fact that this situation has become accepted and the communion between the Orthodox churches has not ceased, this is due to the exercise of a form of economy with the hope and the expectation that a solution will be found that will lead to the return of normality. So in this direction, all the autocephalous Orthodox churches are already cooperating under the supervision of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and they decided to establish episcopal assemblies in the diaspora so as to develop the consciousness of territoriality and of the unity of the Orthodox in the territory independently of their national origin. These assemblies are already functioning successfully, and despite the fact that nationalism, at least in some Orthodox churches, is rather prevalent due to the great trend of migration in some Western countries, God, who is directing history, we hope that it will lead, or He will lead Orthodoxy to recover its ecclesiological canonicity, which is challenged by nationalism. Now, the question is if and whether nationalism will be able to survive in the postmodern era, and what could be the significance of primacy and of the ecclesiology that we presented before in the new era. Postmodernity is characterized by the fact that it questions everything stable, and in combination with globalization and technological developments, it challenges traditional concepts such as those of a nation. This could lead either to a form of internationalism that would also affect the structure of the autocephaly of Orthodox churches, or to a resurgence of nationalism as a reaction to the threat of flattening of cultural particularities, which are necessary for man in order to create, since he is bound to a specific time and place. In any case, the Church has to persist in its eschatological nature, and it should not distort that nature, either abandoning itself to nationalism or to the flattening of diversity and difference. The Church, as the image of the last days, must be the space where difference is not demonized unless it becomes a source of division. And this has to be reflected in the structure of the Church itself and also in the concept of primacy, which is the topic of our presentation. So, if the historical reality leads to a loosening of national boundaries and the promotion of multiculturalism, the Church will need the principle of will need to combine the principle of territoriality with the concept of primacy, so that the cultural differences are overcome in the person of the primate and would not lead to division. This means that Orthodoxy must abandon the current model of diaspora, and to evolve its to develop its canonical structure, which would allow it which will be imposed by multiculturalism, the fact of multiculturalism itself. But if we see a resurgence of nationalism, then the need for primacy will become even more acute. If orthodoxy does not want to be subjugated to nationalistic claims, then it will need more unity in order to overcome its introvertedness and to unite its voice for the overcoming of human problems. This will increase the need for synodicity and for the expansion of the institution of primacy, which is an essential element of orthodoxy. Your Eminence and my dear brothers, the Church exists in the world, but it is not of this world. History, by its very nature, is prone to changes that the Church cannot control. When the Church tried to impede the course of history, it was either subjected to secularization or to marginalization. So the Church moves within the historical changes, but it remains focused on the last days, and this is reflected in its preaching and in its structure. Unfortunately, by adopting nationalism, the Church risks losing its eschatological vision. And that fact would either divide the Church itself if history favors nationalism, or the Church might be marginalized if history leads, the historical current leads in the opposite direction. To the extent that institutions such as autocephaly or primacy serve nationalism, then the danger for the survival of the Church is great. These institutions must be decoupled from nationalism and must restore their purely ecclesiastical character that they had in ancient times. For instance, Pentarchy or the Church of Cyprus were originally not related to nationalism. To the extent that the autocephalous churches were the products of nationalism or serve the aims of nationalism, then they will depend on nationalism. So the more the Church remains faithful in its eschatological vision, then the more it can survive, the more chances it has to survive in history. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Your Eminence. We have about 30 minutes for the discussion, yet before embarking on our discussion, I would like to give 1 minute to our colleague from Russia, Alexei Bodrov, to make something, present something. Please, would you please take a microphone?
Your Eminence, it's great. Yes, it's switched on, I think. Yes? Your Eminence, it's great pleasure and great honor for me to present you with just published Russian translation of your book, Communion and Otherness. It's published by St. Andrew's Biblical Theological Institute, and it's included into series Contemporary Theology, which includes the best available contemporary theology from different Christian traditions, and first of all, of course, Orthodox theology. And moreover, it's included into so-called Golden Series of St. Andrew's, which is, so to say, crème de la crème of contemporary theology.
We proceed now to our discussion. I'm going to collect questions, and I would like to ask you to focus on questions and to avoid lengthy comments. Vasilios Makridis.
Yes.
Thank you very much for both the presentation. My first question is for Father Reverend Grigorios. This issue of globalism, as you referred to. I would say this is almost inevitable as a trend, especially if you look at what has been called global Christianity. Appears as a way to predict what will happen in the future regarding Christianity, and also as an attempt to change the geographical center of Christianity from Europe towards other countries, not European countries, and more specifically Protestant countries. And I would say this is a movement that is gaining ground in the context of globalization. So the this movement is moving towards the diaspora, and my question is, can we stop this movement? And to you now, Your Eminence, your presentation is, of course, from a theological point of view, ideal, but in practice, I'm wondering what would happen. We need to stop autocephaly being infiltrated by nationalism. That's ideally correct. But, for example, the Church of Macedonia, we know that in practice they will be recognized either in 50 or 100 years because we have a historical precedent. In Bulgaria, for example, the conflict was even more acute, but still it was, at the end, it was recognized. I would also like to thank the speakers. Both presentations were great. To Reverend Gregorios, following your the comments by Mr. Kitromilidis yesterday regarding this very stark distinction you've made between État-nation and nation-État, that is the situation in the West and the situation in the East. Mr. Kitromilidis brought us some examples from the West, like, for example, French Enlightenment that by the end of the 19th century led to chauvinism, which, by the way, is a French word. That was the examples by Mr. Kitromilidis. Let me give you an example from the East, from the Near East, our neighborhood. We have the 72 Schism and the beginning of the conflict between Bulgarians and Greeks in Macedonia. So there are Bulgarian-speaking people in Macedonia, and Bulgarian nationalists come and say, using the common language, that these people belong to me. This is typically romantic, typically romantic nationalism, using linguistic identity. And then we have some others who say, okay, these people have a Slavic language, but what is their conscience? The Greek nationalism used the concept of self-determination, which is inherent in the Western nationalism. And using this concept, the Greek nationalists were able to claim these populations based on this argument. So this self-determination, the subjective self-determination of the faithful towards the church, because we always need to keep in mind that the church has its members, leads me to a question for His Eminence. And I would like to note the fact that diaspora is something that we observed in Protestant environments, such as Australia, such as the Americas. In my opinion, the problem is most acute. Of course, there are problems in Western Europe, but there are two types of secularism in Western Europe. You have from one hand, on the one hand, we have the French model, under which the state is being protected by the religion. That's one type of secularization. And on the other hand, we have the United States, in which the state is protecting all religions. In that model, all religions are protected as members of the civil society, and that created a good environment for migrants of different faiths. If migration was to go towards countries not of the free market, or let's say a free market of religions like it is the case or in the United States, then the existence of diaspora would have been much more difficult, and we might even have been wishing that diaspora could have existed. So I see a link between the environment in the United States and the creation of the diaspora. This is...
Yes, thank you very much.
Θεωρώ ότι η ερώτηση είναι προφανής και γι' αυτό θα ήθελα να δώσω το λόγο σε άλλους. Θα παρακαλέσω να είστε όσο το δυνατόν πιο σύντομοι. Thank you very much. Let me personally say that the Metropolitan of Pergamos has helped a lot in creating a unity and having some kind of communication between the local autocephalous churches. And I would say that I agree with the observations of Reverend Thomas, but after studying Saint Athanasius, Saint Athanasius had a principle that when we are referring to the council, we need to take into consideration the time, the object, and the subject of the text that we are referring to. He gave an example where the terms unconfused and undivided referred to Christ, to Jesus Christ. And my question, what I'm wondering is, can we use these terms for another issue, an issue that has appeared only during the past 2 centuries? And my second question, the creation of the Pentarchy plus the Autocephalous Church of Cyprus. You referred to some criteria, such as being the political center, being the ecclesiologically important. Shouldn't we seek to create a new church in the same context and with the same logic as the first 5 patriarchates in the Autocephalous Church was created? Now, let me say that the Church of Cyprus never tried to install a bishop beyond its geographical limits, but we should not forget that there was the Turkish invasion that led to an occupation of 36% of the Cypriot soil in an area where the Turkish population were no more than 18%, we need to keep in mind that the number of Cypriots is a sensitive issue. The number of people that fall under the statute of the Church of Cyprus is sensitive, and I believe that we should take into consideration local differences and local specificities when we make comments about a statute such as this of the Church of Cyprus. And finally, a question to His Eminence of Pergamon. How do you view the proposal for the primates to meet every year? And how do you view the proposal to create more bishop assemblies? Or the creation of an inter-orthodox committee for religious education? This is an interesting proposal. I would like to see how you view that, and why not have more committees and inter-Orthodox committees such as for social issues, such as the environment or other social issues. I think that would create some form of unity, and eventually I believe we could reach what Reverend Thomas was proposing for the unity of the Church. A very, very brief comment. The question will be for His Eminence. In Orthodox theology, unfortunately, for reasons of refusal, we rejected the primacy. We are trying to follow something like a Greek political party of the radical left that has its many different components, and we are trying to create something similar in the Church. We can't. You said that from a Christological point of view, it is unquestionable that the Testament, the Holy Testament, speaks about primacy. But biblical science has shown us that initially, in the most ancient Pauline letters, there is no distinction between the head and the other parts of the Christian body. In later Pauline letters, we see the emergence of this term. So, from a theoretical viewpoint, in the first Christian communities, brotherhood was the term, the most important term, and synodicity played a less important role. Gradually, we moved towards a situation in which primacy became more and more important. So, if we take into consideration these documents when we look at the Eucharist, I think we will have problems. But from an eschatological point of view, if the Eucharist is nothing more than a preview of the kingdom of God, then the argument, I believe, is obvious. Are there or are there not difficulties in the dialogue between us and the interfaith dialogue when it comes to the criteria that will lead in taking decisions regarding primacy? Thank you. Θα δώσω τη δυνατότητα στους ομιλητές να απαντήσουν και μετά θα κάνουμε ένα δεύτερο γύρο ερωτήσεων. Your Eminence. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will try to reply in order of the questions asked, in the same order. Professor Makridis made a comment which I must say that I've heard too many times in my life, that all these things are very idealistic and not practical. Well, I must admit that they are. When I'm talking about eschatology, obviously I'm not talking about something that exists in history. So what? Am I going to stop speaking about eschatology just because it's not practical? I mean, by its own nature, it's not practical. by its own nature, it's not a historical reality. I mean, can you imagine eschatology becoming a historical reality? It wouldn't be eschatology anymore. Like I said, the church is from the world, but not of the world. So it is unavoidable for the church to refer to ideal things that are not practically applicable right now. They are necessary, however, in order for the church to lead its life in the course of history. Now, on the question of the eventual recognition of of Bulgaria, the Bulgarian Church, it was the principles of the 1872 Council were fully respected. Otherwise, we would never have recognized the Bulgarian Church. We recognized the Bulgarian Church precisely because that church ceased to demand having a canonical presence in Constantinople. So they accepted the canonical criterion. So I believe that if in the future at some point we recognize the Church of Macedonia, they will have to accept the sacred canons. And let us not forget that all these phenomena that we are discussing are very recent. For many centuries, the Church applied the principles of territoriality and the principle of primacy without having any problem. The first time we ever had a problem with the principle of territoriality was when the Roman Catholics started the Fourth Crusade. That was the first time that we had multiple jurisdictions. The ancient church, neither in the West nor in the East, had such a problem, had ever had a problem of multiple jurisdictions. The second Patriarch of Jerusalem, the second Patriarch of Constantinople were created at the time, but up until then these were things unheard of. And in Orthodoxy, we are witnessing a violation of this rule right now, or just right now with diaspora. So the tradition is quite clear. For many years, we have applied these principles without problem. Now, regarding the question from Mr. Stamatopoulos about the Protestant environment, I'm afraid it's not, the situation is not precisely like that. Of course, we wouldn't have had an Orthodox diaspora in Spain before the Second Vatican Council. It wouldn't have been possible for historical reasons. But since the Roman Catholic Church started to accept in countries which are primarily Catholic, started to welcome Orthodox people, that created the problem of diaspora. This is a problem that we have in France and Belgium. So yes, it may be true that in the United States and in America, the Protestant environment played a role. And what you referred to as free trade and supermarket of religions, that environment in America, yes, definitely might have played a role, but I wouldn't say this is a prerequisite for the problem of diaspora to emerge. I believe that we are the only ones to blame, that the only problem to blame is ethnophilatism. You propose Your Eminence from Zimbabwe, you propose the creation of assemblies of bishops. I would be very much in favor of that. I would be very much in favor of committees that would discuss social issues. Unfortunately, there are problems between Orthodox churches. This is unfortunate. Now, on the issue raised by Mr. Vassiliadis, I am in a difficult position now, because how can I question something that's relevant to biblical science? But with my little knowledge, I might say that I'm not really sure about what you said. I mean, even from the first Pauline letters, we see the concept of head. Of course, yes, in later Pauline letters, the concept is developed more, but the concept is present from the first Pauline letters, even from the first. And all this terminology, primacy, head, etc., is part of the Christian eschatology. There are many synonyms to the word head that denote, that demonstrate the fact that Jesus Christ is uniting humanity in Him and overcomes divisions. And this is what will happen in the kingdom of God. And I believe this should lead us, should show us the way, should show the way to the church in its administrative structure. There was a question about the difficulties in dialogue, interfaith dialogue. I don't think that what we're discussing now creates problems in interfaith dialogue. I would say that what we're discussing now creates more problems to the Orthodox churches, to some Orthodox churches that seem to be allergic to the concept of primacy, despite the fact that primates exist in all churches. Perhaps this is due to the fact that the word primacy is linked to the issue of the Pope in Rome. It seems that we have we are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But I think that in practical terms it is impossible to have a synod, to have a council without primacy. It is impossible to conceive a church or a synod without a primate. And I believe that the basis for that should be theological, because otherwise we might consider it as something optional, which will make us go down the way of Protestantism. Either we do this, or we find and define a theological basis of it. And the only way for the concept of primacy to be accepted for us Orthodox people is for the primacy to be expressed and applied in the context of synodicity. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, let me start with the question by Mr. Makridis. I'm very happy with the fact that you focused on ecclesiastical globalism, because it is a problem that is coming, that we haven't yet seen, but we will need to I will just give you an example. In Paris, there are school books on the issue of diaspora that say that the issue of diaspora, as we view it today, will not be viewed the same way in a few years' time. And why is that? Because, for example, Greeks are leaving Greece and go all around Europe. we, in Greece, we call them a national diaspora. But when Europe becomes an integrated, even a federal body like the Roman Empire in the past, when they become European citizens, how could we talk about national diaspora then? However, we will still have a global church diaspora, and that would be a transformation. And you also ask, what's the solution? There is the fifth canon of the First Ecumenical Council that refers to two types of jurisdiction: territorial jurisdiction and personal jurisdiction. I can't really elaborate on this, but a bishop, like for example here, the Metropolitan of Dimitriada, he has territorial and personal jurisdiction in his metropolis. That is, his jurisdiction ends at the geographical limits of Dimitriada and to the persons who live in Dimitriada. That is, which means that geographical and personal jurisdiction must be complied to. Both must be valid, both of them. And that the same is the case for the autocephalous church. That is, there is geographical and personal jurisdiction limits that both of them need to be satisfied. From the moment we try to make an artificial distinction between geographical and personal jurisdiction, that creates the problem of diaspora. And what is worse is the fact that there are statutes, church statutes, that create this artificial distinction. You remember in the morning session we talked about the statute of the Church of Russia that refers not only to the Russians in Russia, but also to the Russians all over the world who have voluntarily accepted the jurisdiction of the Church of Russia. That is a case of globalism. That is a case where we have tried to artificially make a distinction between personal and geographical jurisdiction. So the solution is to follow the fifth rule of the First Ecumenical Council, and that automatically will resolve the problem. We don't even need to go any further. Now, on your second question, in conjunction with Mr. Samastapadopoulos' question, it is true that I tried to give you, in a schematic way, in a diagrammatic way, something to facilitate my presentation and our communication. Perhaps I have simplified. Regarding the 19th century, I would like to say perhaps this is a little bit missing from our conference, but still, I mean, we are discussing so many issues. There is an issue that perhaps we have a little bit overlooked. The relation between the 1872 Council with the Macedonian struggle. Wouldn't you see, for example, two different trends, two different groups amongst those who took part in the Macedonian struggle? Let me... Yes, but the speaker is out of mic. Please. Okay, wouldn't you say that there were two different groups among the Greek... Mr. Stamatopoulos, I believe you may be referring to the distinction between Dragoumis, who was talking about an ecumenical Hellenism, and the other group that was talking about annexation. Well, we could make this distinction. I agree. This is what Pavlos Melas calls the national perspective, and this is why Pavlos Melas is the symbol of the national the approach of Telos Agapinos, who said, having his Bulgarian counterpart in front of him, said, we, both of us here, are brothers, and we're making the following mistakes. We behave as if we were two people chasing in front of a bear, which symbolizes the Ottoman Empire, and the two people, before killing the bear, start to argue between them about who is going to take which part of the bear, of the beast. I think that he says, I think what would be best would be to kill the bear first and then discuss all the rest. He started saying that we are brothers, and that was an expression of the universality, of the ecumenicity of the struggle. Dragomis had an imperial logic. He was in favor of the Ottomans against the Slavs. I think I would say this is a complicated issue, Mr. Stamatopoulos said. Now, regarding the interfaith, inter-Orthodox conferences, I'm afraid that would work a little bit like the Greek political parties having an inter-party committee to discuss about the future elections. What happens? They discuss and then they go home and continue their own work. I'm afraid that the same problem could happen with inter-Orthodox committees. Now, about the remark you made about the importance of keeping in mind the time, the subject and the object of when making a reference to a specific text. Here we are discussing more about the ecclesiological perspective, going beyond the specific. I'm trying to find the ecclesiological perspective of concepts such as difference and unity. For example, after a missionary work, the perspective, the objective is to go towards the creation of autocephalous churches. However, the first, third, and fourth ecumenical councils gave us all the arguments we need, all the rules we need to create autocephalous churches. If we follow these rules, we will have no problem at all. And finally, on the issue of statutes, it is a fact that the Church of Cyprus never claimed any jurisdiction outside its geographical limits. However, my remark had to do with the fact that there is a text giving this, allowing for this possibility, and my criticism was based on that text. And let us not forget that the new statute that was voted this year deleted that reference. The first thing that the committee, working together with the Church of Cyprus, asked was to delete that article, and it is in the commendable for the Church of Cyprus that they agreed immediately to delete that reference to Cypriots abroad. So we expect the same thing to happen with other churches such as Russia, etc.
As a methodological...
Λοιπόν, θα ήθελα να σας θέσω το εξής μεθοδολογικό πρόβλημα, να κάνουμε σύντομες ερωτήσεις.
Ναι, μία σύντομη ερώτηση.
We are dealing with nationalism and ecclesiology, and we are focused on diaspora, the issue of diaspora, that is the existence of Orthodox minorities in Western Europe. Could we examine the issue of ecclesiology and nationalism from the reverse perspective, that is, in the institutional and historical centers that express the unity of orthodoxy? What I mean is this. the ancient patriarchates, apart from Antioch, are they Greek patriarchates? Of course, the language of worship is Greek. Their leaders, their heads are Greek. There is even a Greek flag in the great pilgrimages in, for instance, the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. And they are also financed by the Greek government, and they are paid by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the diaspora too, the bishops that belong to the Ecumenical Patriarchate are Greek. The language of worship is again Greek. Of course, I'm not a specialist on canonical matters, but even the selection of the bishops is conducted, of course, by the councils of the patriarchates of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. But I don't know whether they take into account the presence, they take into account the indigenous people there, the people who live there. Maybe we could make some observations at that level in the sense of the institutional and historical representatives of the patriarchates. Maybe there is a kind of nationalism going on there.
Ορίστε.
Με αυτή την ερώτηση παραλείπω στην ουσία όλο.
We discussed mostly about nationalism in inter-Orthodox relations, but what happens with the traditionally Orthodox countries when the issue of nationalism could become a risk for social cohesion? And since His Eminence spoke at the end of his presentation, made two references about the future and the relationship between the church and nationalism, I think we could examine that from the perspective of social cohesion. And finally, we mentioned the issue of alterity, of diversity, coming from Thrace, and where we are experiencing alterity with Christians and Muslims in the same area. I find it rather strange to feel strangely about foreigners when you work with them in the same workplace. I have a colleague, for instance, who voted for the fascist party, the Golden Dawn, although he collaborated with Muslims in his workplace. So what is alterity? What is diversity? When even in that context we cannot accept the other people. Very briefly, too, I want to expand the question of Mr. Makridis. The early church tried to adapt, but it showed, yes, a willingness to adapt, even though there are territorial bishoprics, episcopates everywhere, but there are also some bishops that have been ordained in order to follow the nomads that existed in Syria or Egypt, or there are bishops in Persia with Greek names, and we know from the sources that they minister to captives. So territoriality has not always been observed. So why couldn't we make this adaptation today too? Because sometimes the principle of primacy cannot be understood today, and maybe we could adapt it in order to find a way, in order to show the ecclesiological dimension of the operation of the church, to show it in a contemporary language. Thank you. Two brief questions. The first one is addressed. Why didn't you pose the issue of language? In diaspora, language plays a major role. So how can we overcome the linguistic issues? And secondly,
υπάρχει και η δεύτερη ερώτηση.
Issue of ritual. And the second question regards His Eminence of Pergamon. There is no local church that does not belong to saint.
Θα περιοριστώ για να είμαι σύντομος μόνο στον Άγιο Περγάμου, αφού ευχαριστήσω και τους δύο εισηγητές. Παρακολούθησα με πάρα πολύ μεγάλο ενδιαφέρον την εισήγησή σας.
Listened attentively to your presentation, and I agree in many respects. And tomorrow, in my own presentation, I will try also to elaborate some of the issues that you mentioned. I'm neither a historian nor a canonical specialist, but I have the impression that with regard to the so-called eternal or sacred character of primacy, I have the impression that in the early century there is a fluctuation of primacy. It has not yet been stabilized. And in your effort to establish this eternal dimension, I think that to some extent you have neglected the political factors. That is the fact that Rome becomes the universal center, and Constantinople later in Eastern Christianity assumes that role. So I think there are political factors at work here. Maybe I am mistaken because, as I said, I'm not a canon law specialist or a historian. I have another specific question. To His Eminence of Pergamon. You said in your presentation that in the early church there were clearly linguistic and cultural differences. You mentioned Antioch, where we had Greek-speaking and Syrian-speaking groups, and you said that we were not sure if there were different parishes based on language, but certainly there were no separate dioceses. This is a very important discussion, and I'm very concerned about that, because there is a tendency today by many to solve the scandal of division in the diaspora by establishing a single diocese, but to have parishes that are based on ethnophyletic criteria. So today the situation in the diaspora is a kind of confederation of Orthodox churches. So this idea of creating a single diocese with parishes that are organized on ethnophyletic grounds, I think maybe that leads us to a kind of confederation of churches. Do you understand what I mean? I'm sorry, but I don't exactly remember all the questions. I will answer selectively, and if I have forgotten something, you can remind me. And of course, I remember better the last question. I don't understand why we are moving towards a confederation if we have dioceses with different parishes which have different cultural characteristics. I don't see that. I don't see the logical connection. Sure, but all these things are united in the person of the bishop, and all these differences are overcome through the bishop. We are not against cultural differences, but we need an instrument, a tool that would bind all these differences so as not to become divisions, so as not to become separate churches, so that all these differences coexist within the same church. Because wherever there is a bishop, there we have a church. So we can't have many churches organized based on national differences. And somebody mentioned the issue of language. Of course, yes, this can be solved in this way. Out of mic. The calendar is not an issue. There could be many differences, but these differences should not become the basis for an ecclesiastical body, because the problem of the diaspora is that we established churches on the basis of cultural particularities. The second thing, I would like to ask Mr. Moskos, what he said really they don't apply to what I said. I have studied the historical sources all my life. Where do you see bishops that do not have a territory in the ancient church? Please tell me so. Can you refer me to a specific source? We cannot just speak something out of our own mind, and there is no such church. Excuse me, there is not a single church. And if there is a church, I want a proof of that. So I'm not speaking arbitrarily here. But you cannot question my whole argument by just saying that there could be one or two bishops. This is a very significant issue. You understand that? For me, it's something sacred. So if you say that the unity of the church within the bishop and the Eucharist, it was not applied in the early church, I want some proof for that. These are modern deviations. No, never. There was never such a thing. It was not even conceivable. Even the schismatics, even the heretics, there had to be an ecumenical council, and they would have their own church. But if you belong to the church, then you belong to a particular bishop. There is no exception in the early church from that, and there are no bishops without a territory. Even the titular bishops, they were inconceivable in the early church because the bishops had to have a territory. For instance, I am the Bishop of Pergamon, and I can conduct the liturgy at Pergamon. So with the titular bishops, they cannot conduct the liturgy in their own territory. And of course, that would be inconceivable in the early church. So these are very important issues. There have been distortions of orthodoxy today, at the canonical level at least. And compared to the early church, the situation today is totally different. In the early church, there could be no bishop without his own territory. This is very important. And excuse me for being a little upset, but I don't remember the other questions. Very briefly, I want to say two things on the issue of language. Indeed, there is you can have two Orthodox parishes in France very close to each other, and one is Greek-speaking and the other is Romanian-speaking. And indeed, some difficulties, practical difficulties, could emerge. Or to give you a different example that I experienced 10 years ago when I visited Barcelona. I asked, where do you have an Orthodox church? And the Roman Catholics there conferred, gave a temple at a little church to the Orthodox, and it was taken by the Bulgarian community. So when I visited this Bulgarian church, I found out that in the upper floor there was also a Russian parish, so they gave also space to the Russian community. So it was the ground floor and the first floor. So I moved upstairs and I asked the priest at the end. I said to him, as a Greek, I understand that I can. You could have a Romanian, but you and the Bulgarians, you use the same language. And there is a third tool, the Spanish language, that could also unite you. Why don't you create a single parish and you have two different parishes? And the priest said, this is a canonical ground of the Patriarchate of Moscow. Yes, but downstairs there is a Bulgarian church downstairs, so you can see the ethnophilitism at work here. The linguistic issue can be resolved. I have lived abroad for 25 years, and I can give you proposals about what to do with those issues. And one last thing, the issue of diaspora. To please the biblical scholars in our audience, I will take the example of the exodus of the Jews from Egypt. Moses promised them to lead them to the Holy Land. So he took his people and led them outside Egypt, that is the land of slavery, the land where they were enslaved. This is the condition of the fall in which humanity finds itself. So why does the pre-synodic council does not take place? When Moses led the Jews to the promised land, the people said, "Where are you taking us, Moses? We are going to be hungry. This is a desert." And they started remembering the onions and the garlics that they were eating in Egypt. So the church is trying to take us away from the fall, and we remember the garlics and the onions, that is the race and the nation, and we are not focused on the promised land, which has to do with the kingdom of the last days. For that reason, the people who exited Egypt did not enter into the promised land, not even Moses himself, because he hesitated. So he saw the promised land from afar, and only two persons were able to enter the promised land, Joshua and Caleb. So we won't have the Pan-Orthodox assembly until we have the right mentality of the people who were born in the desert. Those who were born in Egypt were nostalgic about the onions and the garlic. Only those who are born in the desert will be able to experience the Pan-Orthodox assembly.
And the audience wish all of you, and many thanks for the final idea. Wish all of you a nice break.